Welcome back to SPED 738. In this video, we're going to take a look at learning disabilities and those specific to math. So our students who really are struggling with math proficiency, and really kind of look at what the characteristics are of a mathematics disability, look at development of math skills, how we would assess those, and a critical concept with math is how do we promote a positive attitude with our students within math instruction. When we look at math proficiency defined, we really are looking at 4 areas. The first is conceptual understanding. So having a deeper understanding than rote memory that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So almost being able to show us with manipulatives what that problem looks like. And then procedural fluency. So understanding the what, the why, the when, the how of how we solve equations and math problems. And then the strategic competence, and this is where we really take this conceptual understanding, this procedural fluency, and apply it to real-world problems, having that generalization to be able to solve a concept that's challenging with strategy. And then finally, the productive disposition. So that is, we have an understanding that math is functional, that math is valuable for us to know. This is a hard one for a lot of kids, and maybe personally it's been hard for you too. I know this was a challenge for me when I was in school. I didn't really like math. I wasn't very engaged in math. I didn't do well in math. It drove my parents crazy. I wouldn't turn my homework in, those kinds of things, and it was always a challenge. Then I got into my doctoral work and got into pretty high-level statistics courses, and I loved it. Because it was functional, it made sense to me. I could see the value in it, and I did really well in those classes. I still remember to this day my parents saying, how in the world can you ace a 900 level statistics class and you couldn't get past a C in algebra in high school? Because I didn't see the purpose in it. So that's a critical piece of math proficiency as well. With math, it's really important for us to understand as educators that there are building blocks to math that students have to master really in a specific order. And if we miss one of those building blocks, if we take that out, it's really hard to continue to make gains in math independently and do well independently. The first is having that number value sense. So understanding that when I say the number 7, I know what that means. I know what that looks like when it's represented with manipulatives. I understand what it means to have 7 pieces of candy. I understand that if I could choose to have 2 pieces or 7, I want 7. That's more. That number value, that number sense is really critical. The next block that we see with students is learning place value. So understanding where the 1s, the 10s, the 100s are. They have to know that place value to be able to do more advanced addition, subtraction when we're talking about carrying and borrowing. You even have to know place value when you're talking about estimating, right, or rounding. It's really important to know place value. Josie was recently working on rounding in class. And so she would come home with math homework, and it would have the number like 712, and it would round to the tens place. And she was really struggling, and I said, okay, which number is in the tens place? Well, she'd say, I don't know. And so she didn't have that place value knowledge that she needed to be able to do rounding. It was a critical, essential skill for her to have. So we kind of had to backtrack on what she was working on. And then students really need to have, and I apologize, I have an error in my slide here, addition, subtraction, and multiplication and division facts, just quick recall. They've got to memorize. It quickly comes to their mind. They're not counting on their fingers when you say what's 5 plus 3 or what's 5 minus 3. And they're taking them away and doing it with their fingers. They've got to have that quick recall. And then finally, the last kind of essential building block of math is that logic step. So understanding logic when it comes to numbers. For example, if I said all the cats have 4 legs, Fido has 4 legs, then is Fido a cat? Okay, making some logical conclusions with numbers is really critical for students. So as we look at those critical building blocks, I want to take a look at the characteristics of a disability, and you can kind of see where we start to get some gaps in those building blocks, and then it really has a long-term impact on how successful we are in math. One of the basic things that we see, and common things that we see with students with a learning disability in math, is a deficit in basic computation. So these students still are not fluent in their math facts. They may not have a good understanding of one-to-one correspondence and understand really deeply what it means to take 2 plus 2. And they really need to work on that basic computation to develop that basic understanding of numbers, addition, subtraction. Okay. Also, understanding place value is critical there. Another thing that we may see with students with learning disabilities is some kind of visual perception issue. And here, students may have trouble reading multiple digit numbers. So when they see the number 712 written on a piece of paper, they may think that is 721. Their brain isn't processing that number right. Or they may have trouble copying shapes or problems onto a piece of paper. We also can see students with auditory processing issues. So they may really have trouble with oral word problems. They may need it to be in print to be able to solve those. Or they may be unable to count on from a sequence. So if I say count from 10 starting at 30, and I just say it, that may be really hard for them. Or if I say count to 100 starting at number 56, that may be extremely hard for them. So if you work with students that have some of these issues, it's really helpful to kind of know what's contributing to that. Is it a visual perception issue? Is it an auditory processing issue? And that kind of helps us identify interventions. A lot of students that you work with math disabilities will have some kind of motor characteristic involved there, whether it's writing their numbers accurately or writing their numbers where they're legible. Also, sometimes writing numbers too large or unable to line up problems. That's where you'll see oftentimes like students use graph paper to really use those columns and line the numbers up correctly. And then we see some issues with memory. You'll remember from reading the text about students with learning disabilities, memory can be a characteristic. And that can be both long-term and short-term. You know, short-term is maybe forgetting steps to an algorithm. So we can address that by maybe providing a visual of the steps that they need to solve an algorithm or an equation. Or it could be long-term memory issues where we're just really chipping away, working slowly at mastering those facts over time. This is something we're doing with Josie. We're still working on some addition facts that we haven't mastered in 3rd grade and really working on subtraction. Okay, so that long-term memory can really impact their learning. Language is another big issue, and I think this is so important, and I hit on this in the class I teach in the spring for students teaching at the secondary level, students with high incidence disabilities, but how critical it is for us to teach vocabulary to our students. K to 12, when we're talking about math. Math vocabulary is pretty complicated. It's complicated words. They're a challenge to read, so if you have difficulty reading, they can be hard. Sometimes they are pretty abstract. They're hard to understand. So one of the most important things that we can do within a specialized program or individualized program for our students with math disabilities is really focus on that language development and focus on improving that math vocabulary. And then reading, you know, that gets back to that vocab a little bit. If they can't read the words that are in math, it's going to make math really hard, right? And then finally, that abstract reasoning. So can they make comparisons? Can they convert number information to equations, those kinds of things? How hard is that for them? That's a common characteristic of our students with math disabilities. And then finally, that metacognition area. This is where students are either unable to generalize strategies across different types of problems, or maybe they have a difficult time monitoring their problem-solving process. So a lot of times with these students, it's really helpful to have visuals, either visual reminders of that problem-solving process or visual reminders of how to solve a particular equation. Really helpful for them to begin processing what kind of strategies do they use, what's the process that I'm using to solve this problem, and really get that in their mind in a concrete way. They need lots of reminders and assistance in that area. Just some general concepts about teaching math when you're working with a student with a math disability. Being clear about goals for students with that student. So them having a very clear understanding of why they need to learn it and what it is that you're aiming for. What do you want to see them be able to do? It's really helpful to do pre-assessment and really identify appropriate instructional objectives. I think one of the most essential things that you can do is identify that the students have the necessary pre-skills to reach that goal that you've written in the IEP. Okay, so you're not, it's kind of, I always think about Swiss cheese with math. You know, you don't have, the kid doesn't have gaps that you're trying to jump over to reach a particular objective, that they don't have those building blocks in place to really reach. Sometimes when we do assessment, we think, man, we've got to fall all the way back here because they're missing this critical skill right here. You know what? That's okay. They need that critical skill to have all of those blocks, those essential blocks in place to be successful in math. And so that assessment is really critical. And it really is important for us to identify IEP goals and identify those instructional objectives. And then finally, just having good error tolerance and explaining to the student that it's okay to make errors. We're going to make errors in math. The important thing is that we're rewarding those error corrections. So, hey, you got that problem wrong. Let's look at it. Let's figure out how to fix it, and I'll give you points for fixing it. So that reward for error correction can be really critical for these students. And then finally, promoting that positive attitude in math. This concept of learned helplessness in math, I'm sure many of you have run across students who have this. And you know, this really comes from having math instruction that was too challenging for them to begin with. What happened is they got some holes in those building blocks. We started teaching them a skill where they didn't have those essential pre-skills, and it was hard. And so they got some assistance, and they started to lean on that assistance. And we just kept building, even though we had these holes in our learning. And that learned helplessness just gets embedded in what they do in math. It's really hard to break that cycle. And then one of the most important things we can do to break that cycle is to really teach on their level. The other thing we can do to promote that positive attitude is really, make it relevant to their life. However you can do that, it's so important because it's going to become more concrete for them. They're going to get engaged in it more, and they're going to enjoy math more. Using some visuals like, sequencing charts for how to solve problems, or that problem-solving process. Those are good to have for visuals for these students to kind of help them as reminders of how to walk through that process. And then really helping students understand that idea of connecting effort with the outcome. So the more effort you put in your math, the more effort you put into error correction, the outcome's going to be better, that they can do it. As these students progress through school, math becomes so hard for them that they really don't feel like they can do it. They just don't feel like they can do math well. So we really have to retrain their brain to feel like they can have a positive outcome with math. And again, stressing errors are a learning opportunity. We're not going to take points away for an error, up to a given point, right? Sometimes in assessment we've got to just to give ourselves information we need on learner objectives, but really stress that those errors are a learning opportunity. That's a great life skill for them to have. So next, what I want you to do is just take a look at some of the additional resources that we have within the module. There's several in there for you to look at, and then start working on those chapter review questions.